Hello everyone, I'm bringing you the Mannequin of the Month for September 2024 today. Rather than it coming out at the start of the month, which is typical, it's coming out mid-month because I was at Victory Show the weekend, beginning of September, and I didn't have a chance to put the poll together and film and everything else. So it's coming out mid-month. Obviously, in theory, all being well, we'll be back to upload on the 1st of the month, next month, for October's Mannequin of the Month. As is usual, the topic we're going to talk about here was chosen via a poll over on Patreon. As I always mention, the corporal tier over on Patreon get the opportunity to vote each month on what's going to be covered. What we're looking at here is the kit of an Australian infantryman in the early 1980s. So it's quite interesting in that it draws together a lot of the kit which had been introduced and for use during the Vietnam War. It's sort of similar to the British Army in that regard, and you've got developments in the late 50s, 1960s, which then sort of set the pattern of equipment with some modifications through until the end of the Cold War. And that's, I suppose, somewhat true in the British Army, though really combat uniform, the camouflage combat uniform came in the very early 1970s, of course. But in terms of equipment, the 1958 pattern, that carried the British Army basically right the way through the end of the Cold War, with PLCE appearing on the scene very late on. And the same is true of Australia as well. The equipment we have here is basically that developed during the 1960s for use in, was used in Vietnam, a modified version of the M1956 equipment, in part informed by operations in Vietnam and requirements derived from that. And that's what we have on the Mannequin, is a set of that equipment and the uniform, of course. So we'll talk about some of the details of the uniform as well, much of which also dates back to the Vietnam War. So we'll start at the top as we normally do, talking about this in more detail. We first of all have the Australian jungle hat at the top here, which is made in a green drill material, quite similar to its British counterpart. It was issued around this time as well. It does have eyelets rather than the sort of mesh vent eyelets on the side. It just has plain eyelets for ventilation at the top there, but it does have a foliage loop around the brim here, around the top of the brim, and obviously the stitched brim, as you can see there. In terms of form, it's not that dissimilar from the British design. The brim does slope a little bit more of an angle when it's worn compared to British examples, but otherwise it's quite a similar design. Of course, introduced in the 1960s and used through the Vietnam War, and right the way through to the introduction of the destructive pattern camouflage uniform, of course, in the very late 1980s, early 1990s. At the neck opening of the combat jacket here, we can see we have the green shirt, and this is one of various patterns which were worn at the time. This particular example being a standard green shirt. You can't see any of the details, but it has a sort of standard squared off pocket flaps and so forth. A late 1960s manufactured example, which was still being worn into the 1980s, of course. They were manufactured in the 1970s as well, and you also see the pixie or twiggy greens mixed in around the time as well. Particularly the trousers seem to have become quite popular and turn up quite regularly in photographs. So you see a real mix of sort of the pre-existing jungle green uniform, the Australian green uniform, and that which again had been trialled and then introduced during the course of the Vietnam War that was worn as well. So a real mix of patterns of green uniform there. Often that was worn alone, just the shirt and trousers, but in this instance we have a combat jacket over the top, and this is the US design, US manufacturer actually, the M65 combat jacket, and we can see the detail there of the design of the collar and so forth. This particular example is a 60s example. You can see the aluminium zip in there. Later on the zips will be black and brass, but this particular example was manufactured in the 60s, so has the aluminium zip. And then it closes with these blackened brass snaps or press studs, which are concealed down the front here, but you can see those there, and they are just concealed within the front of the coat, and that's how it fastens down the front, with both a zip and press studs or snaps. The pockets all closed with snaps as well, or press studs, as I say, and you have the 4 pockets there, obviously with the pointed pocket flaps. It's essentially an updated version of the 50s combats, which were themselves an update of the 1940s combat uniform, the combat uniform introduced during the course of the Second World War into US service, and Australia adopted the M65 version of this as the sort of combat jacket for the Australian Army. You see them worn very occasionally in Vietnam with Australian advisors working in highland areas, and then you do see them quite commonly in use in Australia with troops on exercise and so forth during the 1970s and 1980s. So we have an example of one of these on the Mannequin here. Quite a nice example. A very brief aside here. When this came to me, this particular jacket had glue marks over both pockets where tapes had been glued on, presumably a name tape, possibly, most probably a US Army tape. There should be a special place in hell for those who attach insignia onto uniforms using glue. but there it is. I managed to scrape away most of that, and then with an iron melt the last bits and scrape it off, and I don't think that looks too bad. Hopefully in the camera it doesn't look too bad. Obviously I wanted an example without tapes, and I've managed to remove most of the residue of the glue, so I think it's much improved in that regard. We'll move on to talk about the equipment now. As already mentioned, this is the modified, or perhaps even improved, Australian version of the US M1956 equipment. Australia had introduced M1956 equipment in the very early 1960s. I believe the introduction date was very early 1960s. Certainly you see in training manuals and so forth at the time, the M1956 equipment is in use. And that was basically made to the first US version of the equipment. So various components were modified over the years, and that initial production for Australia was basically made to the first pattern of all of those components. I think the only exception to that is the dressing compass first aid pouch, the dressing pouch. During the course of the Vietnam War, various modifications were made, and Australia produced its own version of the equipment, which is basically what we can see here. This is a basic set of those modified components, which were essentially standard in Australian service by this time. Although you do still see some of the US components. As time marched on, you actually see some chaps, I believe, privately purchased LC1 components, so you occasionally see LC1 suspenders. And you see, as we have here, in fact, US components still in use, such as the belt. So where components were compatible, they did remain in use. That's far more common in the New Zealand Army, but in Australian Army to a degree you do see that as well. As I say, most of the components we have on the mannequin here are Australian made and of slightly modified Australian design. The suspenders are also Australian made, and these I believe actually post-date the Vietnam War. They're made to the M1956 specification. The actual first pattern of these, they don't have the snap hooks on the back, and we'll see that in just a minute. That was a later addition to the US made components. But the shoulder sections of these are padded and have a nylon lining material, or certainly a man-made lining material. I believe it is nylon in a light green colour, and I believe this does mark these out as post-Vietnam production. I'm happy for clarification on that, but certainly very late or post-Vietnam production. There are some other components on here which are post-Vietnam as well, and we'll see that as we move this round. The ammunition pouches are modified in that they're somewhat taller, as it were, to allow greater carrying capacity and carry longer magazines than was possible with the original M1956 design. And as already mentioned, the belt is standard. This is actually a US made example, and there would still be some of these in Australian stocks. Large quantities of US made equipment were purchased for use prior to the introduction of the Australian made components. So there would certainly been some of these components still in stores and being issued out. So that's just the reason for incorporating that US belt on the mannequin here. One thing you'll notice is the right-hand ammunition pouch has a very typical Australian addition, which is the toggle rope, the nylon toggle rope hung from the grenade loops on the side, and you can see that just hangs down underneath the pouch there. Something I've mentioned in many previous videos which have included this equipment. It's a very common thing to see in Australian service. So that's the front of the mannequin. We'll start moving this around now and talk about some of the other details. Moving on to look at the right-hand side of the mannequin here, we can first of all see the side profile of the hat. And you can see here the two simple eyelets worked into the crown there for ventilation. You can also see the epaulette up on the shoulder of the combat jacket up there. And the sleeve coming down here, there's not a huge amount of detail to look at here. There's no real elbow reinforcement there, as you can see. But you can see how this is shaped to give a little bit of ease in bringing the arm forward to bring a rifle up to the shoulder. And the cuff closes. There is a gusset there, as you can see, and that closes with touch and close or Velcro to give it its trade name. So very simple element of the design there. And round behind this we have the water bottle canteen in its carrier, and you can see here this is a very simple design of carrier based on the US M1956 design. It has the addition of hanger hooks, so it can be hung from the belt like the M1910 equipment or like the British 1944 pattern equipment. This was a feature which Australian troops liked and was incorporated into the modified Australian M1956 design. This is an immediate post-war modification, simplification to the design, which deletes the vertical rows of stitching down the front, which were found on US-made and earlier Australian-made carriers. So just a simplified version of the carrier there, which again would mark out this equipment as post-Vietnam. So that's the detail of what we can see around on the right-hand side there. Moving on to look at the back of the equipment, we do have the field pack here, commonly referred to as the bum pack in Australian service. Of course, it's butt pack in US English, but the bum pack here, which could carry a small load enough for, say, a day or so's exercise in the field. You aren't able to carry very much in there, but they were commonly used, certainly in training, during the 1970s and 1980s. And that is supported by the back of the suspenders here, which you can see come down and clip onto the two eyelets on these tabs here. These have been adjusted up a bit because obviously normally they would come right down to the belt, which is down here. So there's a few inches there that they don't need to extend down. So they've been shortened off to support the field pack directly. Closes with two straps at the front here. This is basically an Australian copy of the US M1961, which was the second version of field pack intended for use with the M1956 equipment. It did get a new number, a new date code, basically a new M number, introduced in 1961, and the Australians then, when they made their version of M1956 modified, they basically copied that design. There are some detailed differences, but it is essentially an M1961 field pack. Nylon edging round there. These were also made post-war as well. There are some detailed differences you see there, but this is a Vietnam era example still in use in the early 1980s, which would of course be very common. There is a window here for a name tag to be added in. The previous owner of this has simply written the name on with permanent marker, presumably a shortening of the name, Hux. So we've got that written across there. That's the back of the Mannequin. We'll move this round and have a look at the left-hand side now. And moving on to look at the left-hand side here, there isn't a huge amount more to talk about. We just have another water bottle around on the hip here. It's common at this time to see Australians carrying 2 water bottles, maybe more. You sometimes see more. This is a very basic set of equipment, and there would be variations to this. Certainly another water bottle, a third water bottle, is a very common addition to the equipment. We only have 2 here. Another point with these, you can't see directly here, but something I have covered in previous videos, in addition to the modifications I've already talked about, these also have belt loops on the back as well, in addition to the slide keepers, or by this time Alice clips. Obviously the US Alice equipment was very much in use by this point, and in addition to those clips, it does have cloth belt loops on the back as well. Another point to note here as well is the water bottle itself, or canteen, is an Australian-made version of the US plastic design, which of course was initially introduced by Canada, but is more commonly associated with the US, and it's just a darker green version of that bottle, and that's the colour Australia chose to make these in, as opposed to the slightly more olive drab of US bottles. So both of these are Australian-made versions of that plastic water bottle or canteen. Of course, one of these would also include a metal cup nested, in which the bottle would nest within the carrier as well. So that's the left-hand side of the Mannequin there, and that concludes the run round looking at the various different components on the equipment and various other details of the Mannequin. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. This topic has been sat as an option on the poll for a little while now, and it topped the poll this month, so I'm very pleased to be able to talk about this finally. It did actually give me a reason to finish cleaning up the jacket. It got put away with a lot of the US kit when it arrived, and when I dug it out, I remembered I needed to do this job, so cleaning off the glue from above the pockets there, and I think that's come up quite well. And certainly otherwise, it's quite a nice example of 60s dated M65, which are getting harder to find now, so I'm very happy to have it in the collection. It is in my size as well, and they're quite a nice jacket, so I may very occasionally just wear this around and about. It's a nice jacket, but great to have from this point of view. As I say, they were used to some degree in country. I've seen a couple of photographs of advisors in the Highlands wearing them during the Vietnam War, and then of course used post-war as well in Australia, with troops in training and so forth, troops on exercise. So very pleased to have this, and hopefully it's been interesting looking at this and the rest of the ensemble on the Mannequin. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my videos and you'd like to support the channel, you can. Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I said at the start of the video, the Corporal tier over on Patreon get the opportunity to vote on what's going to be covered each month in Mannequin of the Month. So go and check that out if you're interested. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below, and I will be posting photographs of this over on those various platforms as well. If you'd like to see stills of this, I tend to do a rotation of various photographs looking at the different aspects of the Mannequin. So you can check those out on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter, whichever is your preference. If you don't have social media and you'd like to get in touch with me, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, which is still on a weekly basis at the moment, I'll say goodbye.